The morning mist hung like a funeral shroud over the Ardennes forest on December 15th, 1944. Staff Sergeant James Murphy of the 106th Infantry Division pulled his wool coat tighter against the bitter cold as he peered through his binoculars at the seemingly peaceful German positions across the valley. For weeks, this sector had been dubbed the Ghost Front by Allied intelligence, a quiet stretch of line where green American divisions could gain experience without facing serious combat. Murphy had no way of knowing that behind the snow-laden pines, over 100,000 German soldiers were preparing for Operation Watch on the Rhine, Adolf Hitler's desperate gamble to split the Allied forces and recapture the vital port of Antwerp. The Führer had assembled his last reserves, the 5th and 6th Panzer Armies, along with the 7th Army, commanded by some of Germany's most experienced generals, including Hasso von Manteuffel and Sepp Dietrich. The American forces stretched thin across the Ardennes were woefully unprepared for what was coming. Major General Troy Middleton's 8th Corps held an 85-mile front, with just 4 divisions a line that military doctrine suggested should be defended by at least twice that number. The soldiers, many of them replacements fresh from training camps in the United States, had been told this was a quiet sector where they could learn the ropes of combat gradually. Private First Class Robert Chen of the 2nd Infantry Division wrote in his diary that evening, describing the eerie silence that had settled over their positions. The crowds had been quiet lately, he noted with prescient unease. Even the artillery has stopped. Something doesn't feel right. His instincts, sharpened by months of fighting across France, were picking up on subtle changes that higher command had missed. As referenced in Stephen Ambrose's comprehensive account, Band of Brothers, the weather had been particularly harsh that December, with heavy snow and sub-zero temperatures making life miserable for both sides. The conditions seemed to favor defense, and American commanders had grown complacent, believing that no sane general would launch a major offensive in such brutal winter conditions. They had forgotten that desperate men often make seemingly insane decisions. In the German positions, Colonel Joachim Peiper of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler was making final preparations for his armored spearhead's advance. His tanks, carefully camouflaged and positioned in the forests, represented the tip of Hitler's last great offensive in the West. Peiper, a veteran of the Eastern Front, understood the critical importance of speed and surprise in the coming attack. The German deception had been masterful. Radio silence had been maintained for weeks. Troop movements had been conducted only at night, and elaborate efforts had been made to mask the sound of tanks and vehicles moving into position. Even the weather seemed to conspire with the Germans, as heavy cloud cover prevented Allied reconnaissance flights from detecting the massive buildup. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, part of the 101st Airborne Division, was among the few Allied officers who sensed something amiss. His paratroopers, veterans of Normandy and Operation Market Garden, had developed an almost supernatural ability to read the battlefield. "Fritz is up to something," Cole confided to his staff that evening, though he couldn't put his finger on exactly what was bothering him about the German positions across no man's land. At 5:30 in the morning on December 16th, 1944, the earth itself seemed to explode. The largest artillery barrage the Western Front had seen since 1918 erupted along the Ardennes, as over 1,600 German guns opened fire simultaneously. The thunderous roar could be heard 50 miles away, and the very ground trembled under the devastating bombardment. Staff Sergeant Murphy dove into his foxhole as shells screamed overhead, the concussion so powerful they lifted him bodily from the frozen earth. All around him, the carefully prepared American positions were being systematically destroyed by the precision German fire. Communication lines were severed, command posts obliterated, and entire companies found themselves cut off from higher headquarters within the first hour of the attack. The artillery preparation lasted exactly 90 minutes, and then an eerie silence fell over the battlefield, broken only by the distant rumble of tank engines and the crunch of jackboots on snow. Through the smoke and morning fog emerged the gray-clad figures of German infantry, advancing in disciplined lines behind their legendary Panzer spearheads. The 6th SS Panzer Army, commanded by Sepp Dietrich, struck the northern shoulder of the American line with devastating effect. Private Chen found himself in the middle of a nightmare as Tiger and Panther tanks rolled through his company's positions like steel behemoths from another age. The American 5th to 7th anti-tank gun proved woefully inadequate against the thick frontal armor of the German heavies. their shells bouncing harmlessly off the advancing monsters. Fall back, screamed Captain Williams, but many of his men never heard the order over the deafening roar of battle. The German plan was audacious in its scope and complexity. 3 entire armies would punch through the thinly held American lines, race to the Meuse River, and then drive north to Antwerp, cutting off the British 21st Army Group and for American armies in the process. If successful, Hitler believed the operation would force the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace, allowing Germany to concentrate all its remaining strength against the Soviets in the east. Colonel Piper's armored spearhead made spectacular initial progress, his tanks and half-tracks racing through the snow-covered forests at breakneck speed. His orders were simple: advance regardless of casualties, bypass strong points, and reach the Meuse River within 48 hours. Behind his panzers came the elite Waffen-SS infantry, their white winter camouflage making them nearly invisible. Against the snow-covered landscape, the American response was initially chaotic and confused. Communication breakdowns meant that many units fought in isolation. Unaware of the scope of the German offensive, Major General Leonard Jarrow, commanding the 5th Corps on the northern shoulder of the attack, struggled to maintain contact with his scattered divisions, as German infiltrators cut telephone lines and radio jamming disrupted wireless communications. But even in the chaos of those first terrible hours, acts of extraordinary heroism began to emerge. Lieutenant Colonel Cole's paratroopers, though caught completely off guard, quickly reorganized and began a fighting withdrawal that would become legendary. Using their training in small unit tactics, they established a series of strong points that slowed the German advance and bought precious time for reinforcements to arrive. The town of St. Vith became a crucial crossroads in the developing battle. Major General Alan Jones, commanding the 106th Infantry Division, made the fateful decision to hold the town at all costs. Recognizing its strategic importance to the German supply lines, his decision would result in one of the most savage battles of the entire offensive, as American forces found themselves surrounded but refusing to surrender. The battle for St. Vith began in earnest on December 17th, as Colonel Piper's spearhead struck the town's outer defenses. Like a steel fist, the American defenders, a mixed bag of infantry, engineers, and artillery units hastily thrown together under Major General Jones, had barely 24 hours to prepare their positions before the full weight of the German offensive fell upon them. Lieutenant Thomas Bradley of the 424th Infantry Regiment watched in fascination and terror as the lead German tanks emerged from the morning fog, their long guns traversing methodically as they searched for targets. The Panther tank, with its sloped armor and deadly 75mm cannon, had become the stuff of nightmares for American infantrymen throughout the European campaign. The initial German assault was repelled by a combination of desperate courage and superior positioning. American bazookas, fired from prepared positions in buildings and cellars, managed to knock out several German armored vehicles, but the cost was terrible. Entire squads were wiped out by return fire from tank main guns and machine guns, their positions obliterated in thunderous explosions that brought down entire buildings. Captain Robert Murphy, no relation to the staff sergeant of the same name, commanded a company of combat engineers who had been pressed into service as infantry. His men, trained to build bridges and clear obstacles, found themselves in vicious house-to-house fighting against elite German paratroopers of the 3rd Parachute Division. "We're engineers, not infantry," Murphy radioed to division headquarters, "but we'll hold this position until relieved or overrun." The German tactics were sophisticated and ruthless. Assault teams would pin down American positions with machine gun fire while other units infiltrated through cellars and sewers to attack from behind. The close quarters combat was savage, with bayonets, grenades, and even entrenching tools used as weapons in the rubble-strewn streets of the medieval town. As documented in Charles MacDonald's authoritative work A Time for Trumpets, the defense of St. Vith represented one of the finest hours of American arms during the entire war. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned, the hastily assembled garrison held out for 6 crucial days, disrupting German timetables and forcing Field Marshal Walter Model to commit additional reserves to reduce the pocket. The weather remained brutally cold, with temperatures dropping to 20 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Frostbite became as dangerous an enemy as German bullets, and medical personnel worked around the clock to treat both combat casualties and cold weather injuries. Ammunition and medical supplies had to be airdropped into the shrinking perimeter. often landing in German-controlled areas and requiring desperate recovery missions to retrieve. Colonel William Fuller, commanding the 38th Armored Infantry Battalion, organized a series of counterattacks designed to disrupt German preparations for their final assault. His Sherman tanks, inferior to the German Panthers and Tigers in direct combat, used their superior mobility and mechanical reliability to conduct hit-and-run attacks that kept the enemy off balance. The civilian population of St. Vith found themselves trapped in the middle of the battle. Many sought shelter in the town's ancient cellars and caves, emerging only when absolutely necessary to search for food or water. American soldiers shared their rations with Belgian families, even as their own supplies dwindled to critical levels. The bonds forged between liberator and liberated during those dark December days would last for generations. German frustration mounted as the tough American defense continued to hold. General von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, personally visited the St. Vith sector to assess the situation. The delay in capturing this vital road junction was already throwing off the carefully planned German timetable, and Hitler was demanding daily progress reports on the offensive's advance toward Antwerp. While the siege of St. Vith continued to rage, a darker chapter in the Battle of the Bulge was unfolding 30 miles to the north. On December 17th, Colonel Piper's armored spearhead encountered a convoy of American vehicles at the crossroads near Malmedy, setting the stage for one of the most infamous war crimes committed on the Western Front. The American convoy belonged to Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, commanded by Captain Roger Mills. The battery was moving south to support infantry units when they ran directly into Piper's advancing panzers near the hamlet of Bonnes. The Americans, lightly armed and completely surprised, had no choice but to surrender when faced with Tiger tanks and SS Panzer Grenadiers. What happened next would shock the world and steel American resolve for the remainder of the battle. Approximately 84 American prisoners of war were herded into a snow-covered field and systematically machine-gunned by members of the 1st SS Panzer Division. Private Warren Schmidt, one of the few survivors, later testified that the Germans walked among the bodies, shooting any man who showed signs of life. The massacre was discovered several hours later by elements of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, who found the frozen corpses scattered across the field like broken dolls. Word of the atrocity spread through American units with lightning speed, transforming what had been a conventional military campaign into a crusade for vengeance. No prisoners became an unofficial motto among many American units, though most officers worked to maintain military discipline and adherence to the Geneva Convention. Technical Sergeant Michael O'Brien of the 9th Armored Division was among the first to see the massacre site. "I've seen a lot of dead men in this war," he wrote to his wife, "but nothing like this. They were murdered in cold blood, and every one of us who saw it swore an oath that day that we would make the Germans pay." The psychological impact of Malmedy on American morale was immeasurable, turning defensive determination into offensive fury. Colonel Piper, meanwhile, continued his advance toward the Meuse River, seemingly unaware that his spearhead's actions had provided the Americans with a powerful propaganda weapon. His tanks and vehicles, painted in winter camouflage and moving at maximum speed, left a trail of destruction through the Belgian countryside. Small villages and isolated farmhouses were overrun before their inhabitants could flee, adding to the growing refugee crisis in the region. As referenced in John Eisenhower's detailed study, The Bitter Woods, American intelligence quickly identified Piper's camp as the primary threat to Allied positions in the northern sector of the Bulge. Air reconnaissance, when weather permitted, tracked the German column's progress and directed fighter bombers to attack the advancing armor. Whenever the clouds lifted sufficiently for close air support operations, the Malmedy massacre had immediate tactical consequences beyond its propaganda value. American units throughout the Ardennes began fighting with a ferocity that surprised even veteran German commanders. Prisoners were rarely taken in the first days following news of the massacre, and German soldiers found themselves facing an enemy motivated by righteous anger rather than simple military duty. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, used news of the massacre to justify extraordinary measures in the defense of the Ardennes. Artillery units were authorized to fire on any target of opportunity, regardless of civilian presence, and Air Force commanders were given carte blanche to attack anything moving on German-controlled roads. The gloves had come off, and the battle the Bulge was about to become significantly more brutal. The weather continued to favor the German offensive, with heavy cloud cover preventing Allied air power from intervening effectively. German weather specialists had predicted this window of opportunity, and Hitler had timed his offensive to take maximum advantage of the overcast skies. That grounded Allied fighter bombers and reconnaissance aircraft as St. Vith continued its heroic but doomed resistance. Another drama was unfolding 60 miles to the south that would become the most famous episode of the entire Battle of the Bulge. The Belgian town of Bastogne, a vital road junction connecting 7 major highways, had become the focal point of the German southern pincer. Under General Heinrich von Luttwitz's 47th Panzer Corps, the American defenders of Bastogne were an unlikely collection of units hastily assembled under desperate circumstances. The 101st Airborne Division, commanded by Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, had been rushed from their rest areas in France and thrown into the path of the advancing German armor. With barely enough time to load their equipment onto trucks, Major Richard Winters of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment led his men into positions around the town just hours before German spearheads began probing the outer defenses. The paratroopers, veterans of Normandy and Market Garden, quickly assessed their situation with the cold professionalism of experienced soldiers. They were outnumbered at least 3-1, short on ammunition, and completely cut off from friendly forces. The initial German assault on December 20th came from multiple directions simultaneously, as von Luttwitz attempted to overwhelm the American defenses through sheer weight of numbers. Panzer Grenadier regiments supported by assault guns struck the northern and eastern approaches to the town, while other units moved to complete the encirclement by cutting the last remaining road. To the south, Captain Harry Kinnard of the Division Artillery observed the German attack through his field glasses, calling down devastating fire from the remaining American guns. "We've got them right where we want them," he remarked with grim humor to his radio operator. Surrounded from the inside, the artillery support proved crucial in breaking up the initial German assaults, but ammunition supplies were already running dangerously low. The siege conditions rapidly became desperate for both civilians and soldiers trapped within the ever-shrinking perimeter. Food was rationed to 1 meal per day, medical supplies were critically short, and the wounded had to be treated in makeshift aid stations established in cellars and churches throughout the town. The local population, led by Mayor Leon Jackman, cooperated fully with the American defenders, sharing their meager supplies and providing intelligence on German movements. On December 22nd, the Germans delivered their famous surrender ultimatum to General McAuliffe, demanding the immediate capitulation of the Bastogne garrison to avoid total annihilation of the defenders. McAuliffe's response became legendary: nuts. When the German negotiators asked for clarification of this American slang term, Colonel Joseph Harper explained that it meant "go to hell." The psychological warfare aspect of the siege intensified as German loudspeakers broadcast propaganda messages in English, attempting to demoralize the American defenders. "Americans, you are surrounded," the German voices proclaimed through the winter darkness. "Your situation is hopeless. Surrender now and you will be treated according to the Geneva Convention." The paratroopers responded with rifle fire and creative profanity. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole's battalion found itself defending the crucial northern approaches to Bastogne, where German armored probes threatened to break through into the town center. His paratroopers had learned to use their limited anti-tank weapons with maximum effectiveness, waiting until German tanks were within 50 yards before firing their bazookas at the more vulnerable side and rear armor. As detailed in Stephen Ambrose's research, the air resupply of Bastogne became a crucial factor in the town's ability to continue resistance. When weather conditions briefly cleared on December 23rd, transport aircraft of the 9th Troop Carrier Command dropped desperately needed supplies into the shrinking defensive perimeter, often flying through intense anti-aircraft fire to deliver ammunition, medical supplies, and food to the besieged garrison. The German frustration with their inability to reduce Bastogne quickly led to increasingly desperate measures. Artillery bombardments intensified, and assault units were reinforced with additional armor and infantry, but the paratroopers held their positions with the tenacity that had made them legendary throughout the European campaign, turning every building and street corner into a fortress. While the paratroopers of Bastogne continued their desperate defense, 60 miles to the south, Lieutenant General George Smith Patton, Jr. was performing what many military historians consider his finest hour. On December 19th, just 3 days after the German offensive began, Patton had received orders from General Bradley to disengage his Third Army from its current operations in the Saar region and swing north to counterattack the southern flank of the German Bulge. The logistical complexity of this maneuver was staggering. Patton had to halt offensive operations along a 100-mile front, turn 3 entire divisions 90 degrees to the north, and advance over difficult terrain in the worst winter weather Europe had experienced in decades. Most military experts believed such a maneuver would take at least 2 weeks to execute properly. Patton promised to attack in 72 hours. Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding Combat Command B of the 4th Armored Division, led the spearhead of Patton's relief force toward Bastogne. His Sherman tanks, equipped with wider tracks for better traction in snow, made steady progress through the Ardennes forest despite fierce German resistance at every crossroads and village. Abrams, a tank commander of legendary skill, pushed his men relentlessly forward, knowing that every hour of delay meant more casualties among the besieged paratroopers. The German forces blocking Patton's advance were no mere rearguard units. Elements of the 5th Parachute Division and the 9th Panzer Division had been specifically positioned to prevent any relief attempt from the south. Their defensive positions, carefully sited to take advantage of the difficult terrain, forced the Americans to fight a series of bloody battles for every mile of advance. Major General Hugh Gaffey, commanding the 4th Armored Division, coordinated the complex advance through some of the most difficult terrain in Western Europe. His tanks had to navigate narrow forest roads, cross dozens of small streams and rivers, and assault German positions that had been fortified for weeks. The weather remained brutally cold, with mechanical failures becoming as serious a problem as enemy action. On December 22nd, the same day the Germans delivered their surrender ultimatum to McAuliffe, Patton met with General Bradley and Field Marshal Montgomery at Verdun to coordinate the Allied counteroffensive. The meeting was tense, with Patton arguing for an immediate all-out attack while Montgomery favored a more cautious approach that would allow time for proper preparation and coordination. As documented in Martin Blumenstein's comprehensive biography, Patton, the man behind the legend, the general's personal intervention at the tactical level proved crucial to the success of the relief operation. Patton visited frontline units personally, inspiring his soldiers with his presence and his absolute confidence in victory. "We're going to go through the Germans like crap through a goose," he told one tank crew, his profanity-laced pep talks becoming legendary among the troops. The advance toward Bastogne became a race against time as intelligence reports indicated that the German forces surrounding the town were preparing for a final assault. Radio contact with the besieged garrison had been intermittent, but the last messages from McAuliffe indicated that ammunition was critically low and casualties were mounting. If relief didn't arrive within 48 hours, the paratroopers might be forced to surrender despite their heroic resistance. Lieutenant Colonel Hal Cohen, commanding a battalion of the 10th Armored Infantry, fought a series of vicious engagements against German defensive positions in the villages south of Bastogne. His men, advancing through knee-deep snow and sub-zero temperatures, had to clear each building individually, often engaging in hand-to-hand combat with fanatic German defenders who had been ordered to hold their positions to the last man. The breakthrough came on December 26th, when elements of the 3rd to 7th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division, finally punched through the German lines and established contact with the Bastogne perimeter. The first tank through the German cordon was commanded by Lieutenant Charles Boggess, whose Sherman rolled into the American positions to the cheers of the exhausted but victorious paratroopers. The relief of Bastogne marked the beginning of the end for Hitler's last great offensive in the West. The German spearheads, already running low on fuel and ammunition, found themselves fighting the two-front battle as Patton's forces pressed from the south while the reorganized American units attacked from the north and east. The dream of reaching Antwerp and splitting the Allied armies was dead, though the fighting would continue for another 3 weeks. The relief of Bastogne on December 26th marked the turning point of the Battle of the Bulge, but the fighting was far from over. Hitler, refusing to acknowledge the failure of his grand offensive, ordered his commanders to continue attacking despite mounting evidence that the operation had become a costly disaster. The German forces, stretched to their breaking point and running critically short of fuel and ammunition, found themselves fighting a desperate defensive battle against steadily increasing Allied pressure. Colonel Piper's armored spearhead, which had penetrated deeper into American lines than any other German unit, found itself trapped near the village of Logley's, surrounded by elements of the 82nd Airborne Division and the 3rd Armored Division. Piper made the painful decision to abandon his heavy equipment and attempt to escape on foot through the snow-covered forests. Of the 5,000 men who had begun the offensive with Camphor Piper, fewer than 800 made it back to German lines. The weather, which had favored the Germans during the opening phase of their offensive, now turned decisively against them. On December 23rd, the skies cleared for the first time in over a week, allowing Allied fighter bombers to take to the air in massive numbers. The 9th Air Force flew over 1,500 sorties that day alone, attacking German supply columns, troop concentrations, and armored formations with devastating effectiveness. Major Robert Johnson, flying a P-47 Thunderbolt with a 356 fighter group, described the carnage from the air. The roads were littered with burning German vehicles. As far as the eye could see, our boys on the ground had done their job holding the line, and now it was our turn to finish what they had started. The interdiction campaign effectively cut German supply lines and prevented the movement of reserves. Two threatened sectors, the American counteroffensive, launched simultaneously from multiple directions, caught the exhausted German forces in a massive pincer movement. From the north, General Lawton Collins' 7th Corps attacked the German salient with 3 armored divisions, while from the south, Patton's 3rd Army continued its relentless advance. The German forces, committed to holding untenable positions by Hitler's no-retreat orders, found themselves trapped in an ever-shrinking pocket. General von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, recognized the hopelessness of the German position and began conducting a fighting withdrawal toward the original Star lines. His experienced divisions, battered but still intact, conducted a series of delaying actions that allowed many German units to escape complete destruction. Manteuffel's tactical skill during the withdrawal phase probably saved thousands of German soldiers from death or capture. The final phase of the battle was characterized by a series of meeting engagements, as German units attempted to disengage, while American forces pressed forward to prevent their escape. Villages that had changed hands multiple times during the offensive were fought over again, often resulting in their complete destruction. The civilian population, caught between the retreating Germans and advancing Americans, suffered terribly during this final phase of the battle. As referenced in Hugh Cole's official U.S. Army history, the Ardennes, Battle of the Bulge, the human cost of Hitler's final gamble was staggering. German casualties exceeded 100,000 men, including many of the Reich's most experienced officers and non-commissioned officers. The loss of irreplaceable equipment, including over 800 tanks and assault guns, crippled German defensive capabilities for the remainder of the war. American casualties were also severe, with over 19,000 killed, wounded, or missing during the 6 weeks of fighting. But unlike the Germans, American losses could be replaced relatively quickly with fresh troops and equipment from the vast industrial base of the United States. The psychological impact of victory in the Ardennes reinvigorated Allied morale and demonstrated that the German army, despite its reputation for tactical excellence, could be decisively defeated. By January 25, 1945, the last German units had been pushed back across their original Star lines, and the Bulge had been completely eliminated. The Battle of the Bulge was over, having delayed the Allied advance into Germany by approximately 6 weeks, but at a cost that Germany could not afford. Hitler's last great gamble had failed, and the path to Berlin lay open before the victorious Allied armies. The lessons learned in the frozen forests of the Ardennes would influence military thinking for generations to come, demonstrating the crucial importance of intelligence, logistics, and air power in modern warfare. But above all, the battle proved that American soldiers, when properly led and motivated, could match the fighting qualities of any army in the world. The citizen soldiers who had held the line in those dark December days had written one of the most glorious chapters in American military history.